Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
It hits the button and records the microphone.
Well, you have to find the button first.
We should give you a flow button.
We should give me a flow button.
We can put it in a Power App.
And then with that Power App, with our flow button, I could start everything. We could automate this entire process.
You could, I don't know, turn your business expertise into solutions with ease?
I could. So maybe we should actually dive into Flow and Power Apps then today. All right. So now that we've talked about Flow and Power Apps, what should we talk about today, Scott?
Let's talk some more about Flow and Power Apps.
All right. That sounds like a good plan.
Well, sometimes you got to plan the work the plan, all that good businessy stuff. And we're going to be talking about some businessy stuff today.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple of kind of newer tools. Well, somewhat new, constantly improving tools from Microsoft that try to help improve some of that business process, help you automate some things, do some stuff with forms. So it should be good. So which one of these do we want to start with?
Well, let's start with Power Apps, and maybe we kind of weave in Flow where it makes sense to along the way. We'll go from there. So what is Power Apps, Ben?
So Power Apps, if you want to reread what you did earlier, it helps you turn your business expertise into solutions with ease.
I like that it's turning us all into poets.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Microsoft.
Hey, you did a nice bit of poetry on the Microsoft Cloud Show the other, a few weeks ago? Well, a couple months ago now. You should come up with a poem for us.
No, I should just go work for Microsoft Marketing and be done with it.
All right. So back into Power Apps. We were easily distracted this morning. Power Apps is, so Microsoft would tell you, I'm going to use their terminology because they don't like to get people confused, and it kind of helped me think about it too, is they would tell you that Power Apps isn't necessarily the replacement or the next iteration of InfoPath. They would tell you that Power Apps is actually the successor to InfoPath. So there's not really going to be a great migration story there. It's not an upgrade. It's not kind of that next version of InfoPath. It is the product that is going to come after InfoPath that you're going to start building all of your new solutions in, or when you want to upgrade a solution, start building it in Power Apps. Don't plan on a migration path. Don't plan on any type of story to really transition from one to the other. As much as if you're going to start building a new form type solution, think Power Apps first. So Power Apps really is going to have two kind of different features. Hopefully they kind of bring it together a little bit more. But right now you can do an app that is essentially a mobile app, a tablet app, a phone app for running on your iPad, your Android. If you want to render this app, this form in the browser, you can open it in the browser. You can do some things like grab an embed code and embed it different places. But what you really end up with is a rendering of that app in either the phone or the tablet UI type interface. So it's almost like it looks like you're emulating an iPad or an iPhone in your browser when you interact with the apps the way they are today in the browser. So that's one aspect to Power Apps, is that mobile app on your device, on your mobile devices, that it's kind of a form, kind of an app, and we can dive into some of that a little bit more. But then one of the things they've demoed recently, I think back on May 4th, they first talked about it. At Ignite, they demoed it a lot more. It's going to be coming here pretty quickly. I think in the next month or two is when it's going to start maybe rolling out to those first releases. Is Power Apps is also going to be that tool, that utility that lets you customize your SharePoint form. So your view form, your edit form. If you want to create a fancy new interface for SharePoint lists and libraries, Power Apps is going to be your tool to do that too.
Awesome. So let's just kind of distill that down and bring it back. So Power Apps is a web-based forms engine that lets you render responsive forms and can be packaged and delivered across multiple platforms, right? So you talked about web browsers and mobile devices in the forms of iOS and Android devices. and then we can bind to multiple data sources, right? So you mentioned SharePoint as a data source. I'd imagine I can bind to other things in the background. So before we get into some of that functionality, let's talk a little bit about licensing and kind of how this is lit up, particularly within the context of Office 365.
So, and before we do that, can I burst your bubble on one thing you said, that it was responsive?
Well, it is in the sense if I design a form for a tablet and I design a form for a mobile thing, the app's going to render the right one for me, right?
Yes, if you design them both. But it's not like you can really design. So if you update your phone app, you also have to go update the tablet app. It renders properly if you design one for both. It is two very different, unique apps. So what I think of responsive is if you have a web page and you resize it, it kind of rearranges everything for you based on the size of the device you're rendering on. With PowerApps, you create the two different layouts and it kind of picks the right layout. It's not like, so say for instance, you're in a browser and you open it in the tablet mode and you resize your browser window, it's not going to resize it for the mobile phone. Or if you design it for the mobile phone and then pull out a tablet, it's not going to responsively adjust automatically for you. You have to do all of that programming, that arranging on the back end yourself.
Correct, unless I'm in a web form like a SharePoint list form, which then it does become responsive.
Right. Yeah.
Because, hey.
We just wanted to make that not confusing at all for anybody.
Well, thank you for introducing extra confusion. It's just what I needed this morning.
I could get another cup of coffee. You'll be fine. So back to the pricing, licensing. What do you have there for that pricing licensing? It looks like maybe we have a few different options, kind of like all of these different SharePoint or Office 365 plans. Do you have some options around licensing for PowerApps?
So it's included in some Office 365 plans, first and foremost, right? So across things like the business SKUs, Business Essentials, Business Premium, Office 365 for education, so Education, Education Plus, and then the E1s, E3s, and E5s. So that's kind of how they break down there. Dynamics for 365, if any customers have that. There's also PowerApps included in some of those SKUs as well. And then, it gets a little bit confusing after that because you start to get into some of the other like kiosk SKUs, frontline worker SKUs, so the F1s, things like that. And there's really two tiers within PowerApps. So you have PowerApps P1s and PowerApps P2s. And then it gets a little bit more confusing because things like PowerApps also include capabilities for Microsoft Flow, which we're probably going to talk about in just a little bit.
Yeah, it does. And the nice thing is that you at least have some of that limited functionality if you have an Office 365 plan. But what I've found as users start using this is there are certain things that it's surprising how quick they find themselves wanting to go to a P1 plan or a P2 plan to add some of that additional functionality on top of the P1. One of the biggest ones that I know I've had some clients that want to leverage it, and we'll dive into this too, is the common data service is not included at all with any of those Office 365 plans. So you have to upgrade right away to a P1 or a P2 if you want to use the common data service. And then the other one tends to be, the other biggest difference is some of the connectors that are available to tie into third-party data sources that are outside of that Office 365 environment. So we'll dive into that a little bit more, but then I don't know, for me, it adds up pretty quick. You get that Office 365 plan that's free, but then if you want that P1 that just lets you leverage the common data service or connect to some of those premium connectors, it's $7 a user a month. And the next plan, going up to P2 to leverage even more of the common data service, some enterprise grade administration. So if you want to kind of manage all of this at an enterprise level, a lot of that functionality is in the P2. That one's $40 a user a month. That's more than like any of the E plans.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. So if you're running like an E1 or an E3 and you want to manage these, all of a sudden your licensing costs jump from like $20 a user a month to $60 a user a month. So this is one thing I need to look at a little bit more, because as I was talking about it, I don't know that you have to do P2 for all of your users. It may just be the ones where you actually have to, the ones that need to do the administration. I think I looked at that and I'm blanking right now.
Horrible.
I know.
We like you anyway. So across all of these things though, so regardless of whether I'm so let's just say I'm an Office 365 subscriber, right? And I'm rocking my E1, E3, E5, whatever it is, because friends don't let my friends buy anything that's not an eSKU. There's still some limitations and things that go in there, right? Because this is a per user service, but it's bound at the tenant level. Can we talk a little bit about some of that stuff? So are there because it ties into flow and things like that. So do we run into execution limits? How many of these apps we can put out there? All that good kind of stuff?
Yeah, you do. So there are definitely some limits around them. Like you said, you get some of the flow licensing as part of the PowerApps licensing. In addition, you get 200 flow runs per month per user as part of that initial Office 365 licensing of both of them. So that's one of the biggest limitations. Whether you consider 200 flow runs a month a limitation, that's a lot of flows. And think of flows. So this is probably a good time to go in and actually define what a flow is.
So hold on, you said 200, it's 2,000.
It's 2,000. I misspoke, thanks. Add that extra zero. That zero makes a big difference. So yeah, it's 2,000 flows, and a flow is essentially a workflow. So think of flow as the next iteration, and again, not necessarily the replacement, but the successor of those SharePoint workflows. So before you had SharePoint workflows, you could, based on actions in a SharePoint list, you could call some REST services. You could do some Visual Studio magic to tie into some other third-party services. But those SharePoint workflows, by and large, ran within SharePoint and worked within SharePoint. They were tied very closely to SharePoint. Flow, as kind of the successor, the next version of Microsoft's workflow engine, is completely independent of SharePoint. So if you've used a Zapier, or even an if this then that, it's more similar to Zapier than an if this then that, but it's a workflow engine that sits outside of it that interacts both with SharePoint as well as with a slew of third-party products. So they have hundreds of different ones. I don't know what the exact count is right now, but this works with Twitter, with Outlook, with Yammer, with Excel. They recently rolled out functionality to allow this to work with Microsoft Teams. With Office 365 groups, you can schedule it to run on a recurring basis. So as you create these different workflows, whether it's triggered from a SharePoint list or whether you have some automated flow that runs once every hour, each time you trigger a new flow to start running, it counts as one run against that 2,000 flows per month limit. So if you're triggering these off of a SharePoint list, you have to add a lot of items to a SharePoint list to get up to 2,000 flows a month. If you're triggering these so that a flow runs every second or every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, obviously you can quickly get up to that number of flows that you're going to use out of that quota. So that's something to think about as you're looking at flows. And the reason this all ties into PowerApps is you can trigger flows off of PowerApps. So as you're working with your data in PowerApps and in the Common Data Service, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or even a SharePoint list, you can tie PowerApps and Flow together to create those business applications and those business processes and really help automate those and create a nice front end for users to be able to interact with your data.
It's a little tough to size and figure out how you are going to operationally control things because you don't have too much awareness, right? So say you have an organization with 1,000 users. Well, each user is getting 2,000 flow executions per month in those eSKUs. And then you go, well, out of my 1,000 users, maybe only 200 of them use flow. So realistically, I have 2 million executions across my tenant. How you consume those and what they actually end up looking like and how you govern that is all very messy.
Yeah. And you can, like we said, you do have that bundle of flow that's kind of included with Office 365. So you get your base version of PowerApps and you get your base version of Flow that are both included with an Office 365 plan, if you do need more executions, more runs of a particular flow, you can upgrade to a Flow P1 or a Flow P2. So just like with PowerApps, you also have these additional levels of flow that going up to a Flow Plan 1 gives you an additional 2,500, so 4,500 runs per user per month. All of these plans include unlimited flows, so you're not capped at how many you can create. It's just how many of them can run.
Right. At what point do I start paying?
Right. Exactly.
Or paying more than I'm already paying for my...
Paying more than, or buying extra, because you can also, well, I'll get into that in a minute. And then the next one, you can bump up to that P2, which gives you 15,000 runs per user per month. So you add another 10,000 runs. And then you do get some additional benefits to some of those premium connectors. So things like connecting to Salesforce or connecting to the Common Data Service, those are considered premium connectors. So there's kind of those two levels of connectors if you want to connect to those third-party data sources, as well as some quicker checks. So with that free plan, these flows check for updates, check for changes every 5 minutes on the free plan, every 3 minutes on F1 or P1, Flow P1. I don't want to confuse these with frontline worker plans. And then 1 minute checks on Flow Plan 2. So the speed at which these will check for new information to trigger a new flow, to launch a flow, also increases as you scale up. And then finally, if you don't necessarily want to upgrade all your users to Flow Plan 1 or Plan 2, if you use all the flow runs included in your tenant, you can buy more flow runs independently in increments of up to 50,000 flow runs per month. So they don't have the pricing for that on their page. I don't think they have that anywhere. There it is. Additional, so for every 50,000 runs, it's an additional $4 a month. So, I mean, relatively reasonable if you have to run a whole bunch of flows, as you can just buy additional 50,000 runs. You don't necessarily have to upgrade all of your users unless you want some of that additional capability.
Too bad. So why don't we take a quick minute and do a note from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
All right. We'd like to thank BitWizards for sponsoring the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast. They've won Florida Trend Magazine's Best Companies to Work For 8 years running and have been a Microsoft Gold partner since 2001. Nobody loves Azure like BitWizards. BitWizards is looking for talented, like-minded IT pros with a knack for Azure. If you're listening to this podcast, you'd likely be a great fit at BitWizards. Just think, you could be listening to Scott and me on the beach. Go to bitwizards.com/cloudsmith right now to apply.
And we're back. So we've talked a little bit about licensing and kind of how these two products tie together. Why don't we get into actual usage a little bit and kind of use cases and where all of this plays out. So you mentioned a couple times that there's a service called the Common Data Service, and it's built into the PowerApps side of things, and we might want to make sure we're licensed for it and all that. Can you talk a little bit about what that Common Data Service or CDS is and why people might be interested in looking at that?
Yeah, so we'll talk about this a little bit. We're not going to dive into a ton of details because, like you said, we want to cover some other stuff, but the Common Data Service is an Azure-based platform that Microsoft has created to let you easily build and extend applications with your business data. So that's their verbiage. Essentially what it is it's a database type service that Microsoft has built that is part of kind of the flow in PowerApps for you to put your data in a backend database table structure to be able to access across different apps. So the biggest one that this ties into now is Dynamics 365. So one kind of, and this will be kind of a good segue into some of those use cases, is let's say you are an organization, your salesmen are out on the road. As they get new leads in, or they're talking to clients, you want them to be able to quickly enter those leads onto their mobile devices. So you could build an app that within PowerApps, so build a PowerApps app, give them a nice form to enter in these new leads. As they enter in these leads, they could actually go straight into the common data service. If there was some workflow in there you wanted to do, you can tie in some flows. But let's say they enter this information, it goes into the common data service. That information can then be easily consumed into Dynamics 365 to enter those new sales leads, that new information into Dynamics 365. So it's essentially just a backend table storage to kind of help bridge that gap. Again, it lives in Azure, so I believe they have plans to continue to extend this. So it could be an underlying data structure, data source that kind of spans all of your different Azure, Microsoft cloud-based apps to be able to consume and share that data across all those different areas you might want to access it from, update it from, stuff like that. One nice thing about the Common Data Service, as they're improving it and expanding it, it has some of those certifications, ISO certification, it has HIPAA compliance. So if you're looking to store data in a secure method that meets some of those compliance features, the Common Data Service is a good place to look to do all of that. And in addition, Flow does tie into it. So I've done one where you enter data in an app, it goes in the Common Data Service, it could be consumed by Dynamics, but then you could also trigger off a flow. So every time something's added to that Common Data Service table storage structure, it goes through some approval process that marks them as approved in the Common Data Service. It could go shove it into a SharePoint list somewhere. It could, again, go trigger off a giant flow. Maybe it's a new employee that goes and triggers off the whole onboarding flow once they get added to that Common Data Service. That's what it is. I'd encourage you guys to at least sign up for a trial of it and play with it. It's interesting. It's a lot easier to work with than, say, going up and creating a SQL server, especially if you're giving this to those power users to create their own apps. And as we get into scenarios, that's another part that we should touch on, is just how easy some of this stuff is. It doesn't require a bunch of coding expertise or really advanced IT knowledge to be able to create some of this stuff the way Microsoft has done it.
Gotcha. Yeah, so actually that's a good point. So let's get into some of that a little bit. So I am a user and I want to create a Power App and I'm licensed for it. So in today's world, I can do that through a web browser. There's also a PowerApps Designer Studio available for Windows 10 users in the Windows Store. Gives people a little bit more to kind of go off and run on there. But that's pretty much it, right? I just need a license and I just need to have that tile available to me, and then I can go create this stuff, or I'll see a PowerApps button inside of kind of my ECBs and control blocks and things inside of SharePoint, right?
Yep, that's it. So again, I run on a Mac. I can create an entire PowerApps app pretty quickly on my Mac just using the Chrome browser. So like you said, that's, if you have the license, just go in and start creating it. It's a very GUI-friendly drag and drop. I mean, think InfoPath, where you could just drag controls on, you could rearrange them, you could resize them. It's not, you can add code if you want to. It's not a lot of coding to get something up and running. It's very much just a drag and drop, click, select properties, that type of scenario interface.
Awesome. So, I mean, that makes it really turnkey too, right? Just all I need to do is click a button and next, and I'm off and running.
It does.
I've got some business process.
It's super simple. So as an example for a scenario, I was working on a lab for someone recently where they wanted PowerApps, Flow, and the Common Data Service. So granted, I have done this before, but in about 4 hours, I was able to start from scratch, create a brand new Power App. I have a list of devices, so think tablets, computers, laptops that you could order from. I have those stored in SharePoint. I created a Power App that lets a user open up the Power App, go through, filter out which devices they want to look at by the manufacturer, select various devices in the Power App, click a compare button, and quickly compare the specs on these devices in a screen in PowerApps. So they could see memory, CPU, processor. Again, all just pulling from a SharePoint list that had this information. The SharePoint list also had some links to images of these devices, so they could see a nice picture of the device. Then they could select a device, click order device, or submit a request for a device. It would add that request to a table, an entity in the Common Data Service. User's manager would get an approval. They could approve or reject it from the mobile app, from the browser. Again, that's another part of Flow, very easy approvals, but they could approve or reject it. It would notify the user that placed the order of the approval or the rejection and update that table or that entry in the Common Data Service, and if their device was approved or rejected. And it was a fully functional request an order of a new device. Again, all in just a few hours.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's makes it super powerful, right? And like you mentioned, it's, you have this kind of continuum of, I have a user and they saw this PowerApps thing and they clicked into it and they started creating a solution, right? They started a little bit of solutioneering, but it goes way beyond that. You can do some really advanced stuff in there as well. So I've seen some examples, particularly from a couple of the guys that are out in Australia. So Paul Cumsey and John Liu have done a bunch with both Flow and PowerApps to really take them to the next level and not just deliver, simplistic solutions on them, but really deliver full-blown, I would call them a little bit more developer-oriented solutions, right? So let me take things that aren't natively available in PowerApps or Flow, like updating managed metadata in a SharePoint list, and then actually walking through kind of the back-end APIs on the SharePoint side that drive all the being able to communicate from an out-of-process app with the service principal and go back and forth. You can do some super interesting stuff because you have capabilities in Flow to make like HTTP requests, right? So I just want to call an API and like a RESTful endpoint and pull some data back or post some data in to go ahead and move things around a little bit. So you can almost build your own automation engines out of these things if you get really creative with them.
It's incredible. And it's, like you said, it's nice to see how it spans from being super easy for business users to be able to quickly create an app without having to call IT, to custom code a mobile app, to all the way, like you said, where you can create some really, really advanced forms and apps within them. So it spans that entire gamut of users, from your power users all the way to your devs, hardcore IT users that want to take this all to the next level.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think that about takes us to time for today, but we'll probably have to dive into this one a little bit more and kind of talk about operations and administration and how you can put this stuff into a run state in an organization, because it's one thing to talk about the end user side. It's another thing for how you actually operationalize it and move it up. But we'll save that for another time. Everyone can find show notes for this episode, so we'll have links to everything at msclouditpropodcast.com/episode 34. Thanks, Ben.
Yes, not a problem. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next week. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for